Before we jump into today's podcast, I have to say there are stories. And then there are stories that through their transformative events open us up to a wordless knowing that we are all deeply connected. Fill to capacity. Crazy good stories and timely topics. Podcast for people too stubborn to quit and too creative not to make a difference. Inspiring, irreverent, and informative. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Pat Benincasa, and welcome to Fill to Capacity. Today's episode, talking about shared death experiences with Dr. Scott Taylor. And I'd like to just give a brief bio. Dr. Taylor is president of the Expanded Awareness Institute, EAI, which helps people with near-death and shared death experiences. He is a spiritual teacher and speaker, and for over 30 years has researched near-death experiences. He has 6 best-selling guided meditations on near-death experiences. Dr. Taylor has served as president and executive director of the Monroe Institute. Welcome, Dr. Taylor. To say that I am delighted to have you here today, it's an understatement. Welcome.
Thank you, Pat. And I have really been looking forward to this conversation. So, yay. Thank you for the invitation.
Sure. Now, okay, let's cut to the chase, to the serious question I need to know. Now, you've spent time in Minnesota. You went to school.
It's true, a lot.
Okay, a lot of time. And you lived in Minnesota. Now, I am in Minnesota. I live in St. Paul. So I have to ask this question. Do you still do curling?
Oh.
Now, wait, before you answer, for those of you who have not a clue what I'm talking about, curling is a sport where players slide a stone on a sheet of ice towards a target while using a broom to sweep in front of the moving stone. So, Dr. Taylor, please tell us about your curling exploits.
Oh, bye. Okay, we start at the beginning. My earliest memory as a human being is sitting on a curling stone, holding the handle between my legs, and my dad pushing me around the curling rink with his broom. And it just started from there. I won my first tournament when I was 14 years old. In the curling world, we call those bonspiels.
What are they called?
Bonspiels.
Okay.
And yeah, and grew up in curling all over Minnesota and Wisconsin. Then when I became an adult, I moved to the Twin Cities area, Minneapolis and St. Paul, became a member of the St. Paul Curling Club.
Is that on Selby Avenue?
It is indeed.
Okay.
And then there were so many people who wanted to be members of that club. It's designed for about 1,000 members. There are 1,500 members. And when there was an opportunity to break off a club, a sheet of ice became available not too far from there. And so the Frogtown Curling Club became available. And we started up a curling club there. It's been going great guns. And my claim to fame is that in 1991, I was in the Olympic Playdowns.
Wow.
And was for a brief time, I was rated 101st best player in the country.
Okay.
I couldn't get down into the top 100, but I was really, really close.
Well, now that we have that in place, okay. And let's go into our discussion. You had what you call a shared near-death experience. Can you tell us about it, please?
Sure. I was in love with a woman. Her name was Mary Frances, and she and her son Nolan had been out sailing on Lake Washington in southern Minnesota.
Mhm.
And on the way home from that beautiful afternoon of being on the lake, they were involved in a horrific car accident. Mary Fran was killed outright,
Okay.
and Nolan, who just turned 7, had a mortal head wound. And luckily, being in southern Minnesota, they actually took both of them and took them right to the Mayo Clinic and in Rochester. And there, Nolan was in a hospital room while they tended to him, and it took him 6 days to make his transition. Nolan was the eldest grandchild in a family with 9 children. Mary Fran was one of 9. That becomes important because during those 6 days, a lot of the siblings, the cousins, the friends, the boyfriends, the girlfriends, the aunts, uncles, grandpas, they all had a chance to descend on St. Mary's Hospital in Rochester and helped hold vigil.
Okay.
And there were so many of us that we divvied up the time. And Janny, who is Mary Fran's oldest sister, had the two of us had the shift from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. in the morning of the 6th day. And we took our shift, and the idea was, and we all know that hearing is the last sense to go.
Yeah.
And Nolan had been in a coma since the accident. He never regained consciousness. But, we were told and we knew that it was important for him to know that we were there and that we were always, concerned about him. And so we went in and we, read him stories. We talked about the I don't know, there's like 40, 50 people in this really small waiting room that was down the hall. And the brothers had decided that they were tired of sleeping on the floor. And so they had gone throughout the Mayo Clinic Hospital and swiped all of the cushions from the couches from all over the hospital so that they had a place to sleep that was comfortable. So we told him this story, and it just generally kept things light. But about 4:45 in the morning, Janny walked down to the end of the bed, and she was an emergency room nurse, a trained nurse, and she looked at his chart and she saw, where he had been, where he was now, and she looked up at the monitors in the room, and she just shook her head and held out her hand to me and said, "Scott, it's time we say goodbye." And so we pulled up a couple of chairs and sat next to Nolan's head, and we told him that he had been a very brave boy, that he had fought so hard, and that we really respected him for that. But if his mother should come, remembering that she died 6 days before, if his mother should come, if Mary Fran should come, that it was okay for him to leave his physical body and go with her. And that we would always love and respect him, and he would be near and dear to our hearts.
Okay.
Words to that effect. And so we said our goodbyes, and then it's 5 o'clock, and the next shift came in. Well, it wasn't 45 minutes later that the nurse on the floor came into this waiting room where there's people all higgledy-piggledy, and told us that it was time. It was close. So the whole lot of us filed into this little hospital room. And as it just turned out, I was one of the very last to come into the room. And when I did, I mean, it's 4 or 5 deep all the way around the bed already. And I didn't see any point in that. So I just went over and sat on the windowsill next to Mary Fran's brother, Willie. And you just wait. Any of your people listening to the show, there's not much to do.
Yeah.
I think it took about 45 minutes. And, all you're really doing is watching the heart monitor do its thing. And then eventually it flatlines and it does that really ominous tone.
Yeah.
And when Nolan flatlined, what I experienced was Mary Fran coming across the veil and scooping Nolan up out of his physical body. And the two of them had this most exquisite reunion. And I was surprised because I was able to participate in that reunion. I could feel what they were feeling. And I was, in awe, as
Yeah.
you can only imagine, between, what was going on with a mother who's has her child back and has him back safely in her arms again. So, but then something surprised me even more, which was that the two of them then turned, came over to me, embraced me, and then the three of us left and went to the light. And entering the light was the most extraordinary experience I can ever have imagined.
Mm.
It was like I was connected to the love of the universe. It was, I've already used the word exquisite. It was extraordinary. It felt like I was connected to the three of them,
Mhm.
and I was connected to all of us, and I was connected to this extraordinary love that is God's love. I don't want to put it any way than that. And we had time to be with one another and to express our affection
Mhm.
for one another. We had time to say our goodbyes, and we had time just to be there in that space. And then it just felt complete. And at that moment, Mary Fran turned and went further into the light, and I came back to my physical body that was sitting on the windowsill next to Willie. So that's part A of the story. Do you have any questions so far? Because there's a part B.
No, no, that you're really painting a picture of an extraordinary moment in time. So please continue.
So when I was in the light with Mary Fran and Nolan, I was also sitting on the windowsill, fully present, fully conscious,
Mhm.
next to Mary Fran's brother Willie. And today, I didn't have a word for it then, but today I would call that bilocation.
Yes.
I was in two distinct places at the same time. I had two separate consciousnesses that were working perfectly in both locations. And I know this because I was on this windowsill and I am in the light, and it's like the love and light of the universe is trying
Mhm.
to break out of my physical body. And my face just I was just grinning from ear to ear. It was, I'm in this state of ecstasy, in this state of joy, and it is entirely inappropriate for the room. If
Yeah.
anybody had looked at me, they might have misunderstood. So the only thing I could think of to do was to cover my face with my hands. And I remained like that until I came back
Mhm.
to my physical body, and I became one consciousness again. And then I was able to be in the room with the other grieving relatives
Yeah.
and be with them, hug and cry on each other's shoulders, the kinds of things that you would expect.
Mm.
I mean, because they lost Mary Fran 6 days ago, and now they just lost Nolan.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an incredibly sad time, and I needed to be there with them, for
Yeah.
them in that moment, and I was able to do that.
So let me ask you something about that. You had this profound, and that seems like such a limited word, experience, but you kept it to yourself for about 15 years. Do
This is
you think
true.
Do you think that people are afraid to share their experience or they just don't have the words for it?
The answer is yes to both.
Yeah.
I know that was my case. This took place in 1981. Raymond Moody's book had just come out, Life After Life, and he described near death experiences. And that isn't what I had because I didn't have the physical trauma that was described in all the stories that he wrote about. I mean, I'm just sitting on a windowsill. I am physically fine. However, this very unusual thing happened to me. And I didn't have the words for it. I didn't even have the concept for it. I mean, I grew up in a small town in southern Minnesota. I was mainline Presbyterian church, and the lexicon of the Presbyterian church just doesn't include things like
Yeah.
bilocation and being able to witness someone coming across the veil and being able to be in the light with them and communicate. I mean,
Yep.
it's just it's just not there. So it took a while for me to be able to sort out what happened and begin to find words for it. That was the first thing. It was just so outside of my experience. I didn't know what to do with it.
Yep.
And then there's the whole in the near death literature, there's a thing called fear of disclosure.
Wait a minute. Before you go any further, can
Yeah.
you explain to folks what is a near death experience and what is a shared death experience so that they can track this?
Good plan. Okay. So a near death experience, the kinds of things people read about, the white light at the end of the tunnel and all that, the vast majority of them occur when the physical body is so traumatized that it dies.
Okay.
And then our non-physical body lifts up, goes out and has an adventure. Meanwhile, the people back on the physical plane are doing something to try to resurrect this dead body. And they do. There's some sort of intervention that happens, and the body reanimates itself. And when it does, the non-physical body can come back in, reanimate, and we're now one again.
So when people are on the operating table and this is going on and they're doing CPR, whatever they're doing, they're floating above. Often they describe that.
Yep.
And then they come back, slammed back into their body or placed back into their body. That's what you're describing?
Yep, that's
Okay.
exactly right. So that's a near death experience. Shared death experiences are like I described, where you could be bedside and somebody else is making the transition. In my story, it was Nolan.
Okay.
And so Nolan leaves his physical body and invites me to go with him. And in a shared death experience, the experience for me, there's no physical trauma.
Yeah.
You're either bedside or you're at home or you're someplace and you're fine. And the call comes, I'm going to put air quotes on that,
Mhm.
and then you leave and are able to accompany the person who's actually making their transition, and you get to share in what it is they're going through. So
Mhm.
you would be there. So if there was an escort, there'd be three of you,
Mhm.
and you'd be escorted to the light, and you would go through the tunnel and participate in the reunion with the dead relatives and friends and pets, and go through the life review and meet divine beings and go to the reception center. All the kinds of things that happen in a near death experience, those common elements, they call them in the
Yep.
literature, you're able to participate with them in them with the person who's making their transition. So there is one major difference between a shared death experience and a near death experience. And that is that in a near death experience, there is a possibility of what we call a less than positive experience. So maybe people are lost, or they're confused, or they're confronted by beings that seem to be malevolent, or they just have a bad time. They find themselves in a whirling pool of whatever, and they consider this to be a not pleasant
Yeah.
experience. Put it that way,
Yep.
as opposed to a shared death experience where you are actually going with somebody who's making their transition. And in that case, 100% of the time, you go into a benevolent afterlife.
Okay.
And that is brand new research that just came out. So William Peters wrote, he did a study with 800 people, and every single one, 100% of those 800 had a benevolent or had a pleasant experience, and they were able to experience a benevolent afterlife. So in near death experience, there's the opportunity for an unpleasant, and that seems to be by design, like, a wake up call.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe the universe can't reach this person. What better way to say, it's time for a change?
It's time for a change. Yeah, that's the 2x4 method of
Yes.
counseling.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
like, what?
Exactly.
Oh my God.
So NDEs and SDEs are sometimes dismissed as being mechanistic. It's about how the brain functions in extreme circumstances. Will you speak to that?
Sure, I'd be delighted to, because that attitude, that belief system is 24 years old past when it was disproved. So back in 2001, a guy by the name of Pim van Lommel, he's a cardiologist in Amsterdam. He did this really extensive study with 10 hospitals in Amsterdam, and essentially, I'm going to make this short because it's a wonderfully complicated and just beautifully, exquisitely designed experiment. Pim van Lommel's experiment goes like this: people come into a hospital emergency room and they're displaying a heart condition, something,
Yep.
some chest pain. And the very first thing that happens when you go into a hospital room anywhere in the world is they put monitors all over you, so they know exactly what happened. Then some of those people, while they're in the emergency room, they arrest. And some of those people have come back to life again. They're able to resuscitate them. And some of those people had an experience. So here's what we know. Pim van Lommel goes on to great lengths to say that once the heart stops, in approximately 10 seconds, the brain flatlines. And so when the brain stops functioning 10 seconds after the heart does, it is incapable of making memory, period, full stop. You cannot have a memory. But what he did, really interesting, was when people came back, those that he was able to resuscitate, he would ask them a question like, did anything happen to you while you were unconscious? Isn't that an interesting question?
Yeah.
Did anything happen to you while you couldn't possibly be conscious? And about 17, 19% of the people said yes. And they went on to describe what happened in the operating room, what the conversations that were happening, what was going on with the monitors in the room. Some of them were able, when they left their physical body, they were able to, move around the room. So they were seeing monitors that couldn't possibly be able to see from the gurney. And then some of those people got tired of waiting around. And so they went out and they were in the waiting room with their relatives who were concerned about them, and heard their conversations and what they bought at the candy machine, and all of these wonderful stories, exquisite detail that said, while this person was unconscious, and we know that because they were monitored, we know exactly when they flatlined and when their brainwave patterns came back up again. And during that period when they were flatlined, no memory should be able to happen.
Yeah.
They're out looking at the relatives buying candy in the candy machine, and having all these other kinds of experiences with, being able to hear, being able to see, being able to
Yeah.
sense things. And so, in a very exquisite way, he was able to show that consciousness is not a function of the physical body. It resides within the non-physical body,
Hmm.
and that consciousness is not a function of the brain. Consciousness just is. It is what we are when we are, it resides within that non-physical body. And we've been thinking about the brain all wrong. That particular experiment has been duplicated twice with Dr.
Okay.
Fennick in England and Bruce Grayson here at University of Virginia, just down the road from me. And so they've duplicated it in two different locations in the world. And so it's now the standard for how do we think about consciousness. And so that whole mechanistic thing, I mean, it was for a while, and
Yep.
legitimately so. We should ask those questions. Is it about asphyxia? Is it about, memory from birth? That's my
Yep.
favorite. Go to the light. Is it the result of DMT or
Yep.
other chemicals that the brain releases? And the answer over and over again is no, it's not.
Well, then let me digress for a moment. Now,
Please do, Pat.
I'm going there. Okay. In the West, we see time with fixed assumptions or being linear. Yet we dream, we recollect, we recall, we fantasize, we daydream. We have moments of deja vu. These are different modalities of time that people experience. So could NDEs and SDEs also be another variation of time, allowing us to travel in a non-physical way?
Oh, yeah. It happens all the time in near death and shared death experiences. Case in point, the life review. So there's a significant portion of people who, in their near death experience, go through a life review. And a life review has three different components to it. So you get to live your life over again, and you get to live it exactly the way it happened, with all the feelings, the
Mhm.
sensations, the thoughts, all of it, except it happens instantaneously. I
Yep.
mean, it doesn't follow, which is really hard to describe. That's why the first common element that people talk about with near death experience is that it's ineffable, which
Mhm.
is a great English word that means we don't have any English words for it.
Yeah.
All of that happens all at once. And people talk about, life flashed in front of my eyes. Yeah, absolutely. And at the same time, I had a guy describe, he was going through his life review, and one of the things he loved to do was mow his lawn. And so in his life review, he got to spend time mowing his lawn because that was just a favorite event. And what he was able to do was to slow it down. You can speed up or slow down the time when you're doing this review. And he said he could slow it way down, and everything is in super HD. That means, he said, I could count. He slowed time down. He said I could count the number of mosquitoes that were suspended in the air.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Wow.
which is important in Minnesota
Yeah. Oh,
because
yeah.
our state bird, right?
Yes.
Um, and so you could speed it up, slow it down, zoom in, zoom out. So we have, just in that example, we have two different times of time all at once, and the ability to change it. It could be faster, it could be slower.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's first. Number two is that you get to experience your life as the other in the scene. So, Pat, if you and I were having a life review, I'd be living my life, and I'd be living it from your perspective.
Hmm.
So I get to know exactly what you felt and what you
Yeah.
are emotionally, what you're thinking, plus all the sensations of the physical body. And then third is the omniscient point of view. So there's that. So you get to look down on the scene and you go, oh, I can see how this interaction between Scott and Pat,
Hmm.
how it affects both of them. And then how does it affect their friends and family and their community and the nation
Wow.
and the world and all of human history? How does this particular interaction play out in all of its beautiful detail? And so here again, we have a different kind of time that takes place because with the omniscient point of view, I mean, we could be looking out centuries. Just think of the effect that a historical figure like George Washington or
Hmm.
Jesus Christ or Buddha, pick one. And, here we are 2000 years later, and we're still talking about Jesus, or we're still talking about what democracy is
Hmm.
and how it should be celebrated. So we have another dimension of time in that we get to see how it ripples. And so, yes, so time is not linear, it's not constant. It is it can have all of those different kinds of qualities and more that I probably haven't described. So it's a much more complicated way to be when you're in the non-physical world if you're viewing it through the eyes of someone in the physical. So if you're trying to describe what is going on in the non-physical, using the words and terminology and paradigms of the
Hmm.
physical, you wind up in a lot of trouble. My
Yep.
favorite story about that is at the beginning. If you're a Bible fan, you know, let's think of it like this. So there's a monk who goes up at the top of the mountain and he meditates his brain out for a long time. And at one point, a divine being comes and shows him the creation of the universe. And he comes back and he's going, the world was created in 7 days. Well, six actually. And then on the seventh day, it rested. But it's also 13.6 billion years old. And so here's this poor guy. He's trying to describe this event that took place outside of time, but he's having to use words that are constrained by time. And, so what is a day? And so it becomes really, I have a lot of patience and for for people who are trying to explain what happened to them in the non-physical world, like when you're listening to a near-death
Yeah.
experience, because they're trying mightily to have it make sense from a paradigm that's not really suited for it.
You write on your website because an NDE includes transcendental and mystical elements, it is a powerful event of consciousness.
Yep.
What you've just described is that sentence.
Mhm.
Really?
It- it's an extraordinary event. I mean, for those of us who you know grew up in southern Minnesota, blah blah blah, and all of a sudden you're thrust into a world where the rules just aren't the same, and you don't know what the rules are, and it's one of the reasons that meditators have an advantage
Yep.
in that they're able to go there and have the time and the tools to explore this non-physical universe, whereas with a near death experience, most of the people, you aren't expecting it.
Yep.
It's a car accident, right? Boom, all of a sudden you are in a new environment and you don't know what's going on, you don't know who these people are, they don't look the same, you're talking telepathically, and as a result the NDE happens to you as opposed to it being a co-creative effort. And that's just fine, but it means that they are restrained in their stories by what are the metaphors that are in their head.
Okay, now that leads me, you just gave me a beautiful segue. Do you think having an NDE or an SDE allows a person to create space for contradiction? By that I mean, contradiction is the ability to hold opposing thoughts at one time. It really obliterates any kind of black, white, yes, no worldview. Is that another way of saying what you just said?
Oh, yeah. And just using my story, I'm in the light with Mary Fran and Nolan, and I'm sitting in the hospital room with on the windowsill next to Willie. That's a contradiction. I
Yes.
mean, I should be there or here, but that's not it. So a segue back is the rules of the physical universe are determined by the words either or. So there's Pat, there's Scott. It's either you or me. And we are separate and we go do our thing. In the non physical universe, it's run by the words both and. So you are you and I am me and we are separate. Okay. We have our separate consciousnesses and we are also tied together. We are made up of the same stuff.
Hmm.
We are hooked together consciously. And frankly, the whole human race has this collective consciousness that we are plugged into.
Yeah.
And so we can participate in and know that we are really all one very large family that is united. So that's a contradiction. It's
Hmm.
you or me. No, it's really you and me. And we're also one, we're tied together. The non physical universe in the literature is often referred to as the unity universe,
Hmm.
where everything is connected. And that's where we come from. And that's where we are returning to. It's just that in this particular physical life, we have chosen to accept a filter.
Really, what you're talking about, Scott, is how do we live and be open to mystery? We live in a world where mastery is dominant.
Mm,
We control. We're in charge. It's yes, no. We measure everything. We measure everything. We have this mental measuring tape for what we accomplish in a day, what we've achieved. And our life is like a string of beads of achievement or accomplishments. And then you have, on the other hand, this thing called mystery, where it's non physical.
yes. And so it goes back to purpose. Why are we in this physical universe? And bless their hearts, my father-in-law, engineer for American Motors. And that is one way to look at the universe.
Yeah.
However, everybody that comes back from a near-death experience or comes back with a shared death experience or frankly just has a spiritually transformative experience,
Yeah.
talk about, what's our role here? What are we really all about? And it boils down to love, learning how to increase our capacity to love
Yes.
and the knowledge that we gain through that. So we're pretty good on the knowledge part. Would you call it a mental measuring tape?
Yeah. It's a mental measuring tape.
I love that. May I use that?
Oh, please do. I'm an artist. I build all the time. So measuring tapes are something very real to me.
Yeah. But the folks that come back, we have to do that to survive here in the physical world. But it's really about how do we treat each other every day?
Yes.
How do we treat ourselves every day? And that is the measuring tape that really matters.
Yes.
And so near death experiencers reset that whatever it is that we're going to quantify,
Hmm.
it's now changed. And it's has to do with what's our loving connection. Are we learning to increase our capacity to love?
So let's go back for a moment, thinking about your shared near death experience with Mary Fran, a woman you loved, and her 7-year-old son, Nolan. It seems that love is the pathway by which to travel in this experience. So it creates this transformative alchemy of possibility to journey and witness unbound love.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up because we now know a lot about the language has now changed. It used to be known as a shared near-death experience. Now they've
Okay.
just dropped the near. It's a shared death experience. Thank you again. That was Raymond Moody who did that. In writing about shared death experiences, there are some criteria that seem to be involved in that. One is that there's a heart connection between you and the person making the transition. And in my case, the connection, Mary Fran was a single mother. The biological father disavowed any knowledge of his actions and refused to be part of their life. And so she never told Nolan who his biological father was. And when I came into his life, he looked to me that way,
Mm-hmm.
like with a father figure, because frankly, and he told me he wanted to have a dad
Sure.
like all the other 7-year-olds in school. And, it was really important to him. And so, and I was fine with that. It was an amazing, amazing boy. And so
Hmm.
there needs to be a heart connection. And so the second thing is there needs to be a connection, an invitation, and it comes from the non-physical to the physical, which meant that the invitation had to come from Nolan and his mother to me to join them. It doesn't work the other way around. So that is part of the connection. And another part of it is that the person who is me, the person making the transition, needs to be receptive and open.
Yeah.
And in my case, I was sitting on a windowsill. I'm watching the heart monitor. So there's actually not much going on. I would probably say that I was in some sort of a meditative state,
Yeah.
just watching this thing. And that happens to people. Like they talk about their at home reading, or they're on the edge of sleep or something, and the invitation comes and they find themselves off and running with their relative. And so that's a nuanced thing.
Yeah.
And what William Peters talks about is that you can line that up ahead of time. And the secret is the life review. And I hadn't figured this out, but all credit to William Peters on this one. And so what happens is that two people, say my wife and I, we make a mutual pact that whoever goes first comes back and invites the other to share the experience.
Nice.
Okay, so we have this agreement between the two of us. And the triggering event will happen during the near death experience when I am on the corner of 11th and LaSalle in downtown Minneapolis. I meet my wife for the first time.
Hmm.
And so on that street corner, when I relive my life, that scene will be in there. And when that scene happens, that's the trigger for me to remember to go back into the physical world, pick up Anne, and bring her with me on this journey in the non-physical.
Oh, that's
So
lovely.
isn't that fun? And it's
Oh,
not that
that's
hard.
beautiful. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. It's like if you're going to take a plane trip, you have to have an itinerary. Okay. So you go to the travel agent, you're going to the cosmic travel agent and basically saying, yeah, I want to book this trip for either one of us. We don't know who's going first, but here's the itinerary. So you tell the universe, you kind of lay it out for them.
Yep. You just lay it out for them. And all we need is a triggering event, and you get the call, and off you
You're
go.
off. So now what's amazing about this, I was thinking about the trauma and rawness of Mary Fran and Nolan's death, that you were not a passive spectator, but you were called, invited to participate and join them in their leaving. Was that healing for you?
um, wow. That's a really interesting question. Um, yes and no. um, so it goes like this. So whenever I tell that experience, sometimes my voice catches as it's emotional to talk about the two of them leaving.
Yeah.
And what makes it complicated is that in the moment of my greatest grief, I was in my greatest joy.
Yeah.
That story, I am profoundly grieving for the loss of first Mary Fran and then at that moment losing Nolan. But I'm in contact with the love of I am the love of the universe.
Yes.
And so was it healing? Well, yeah, because I I get to understand more about who we are as human beings and our multidimensional selves and what it means to connect
Yeah.
and have affection. Well, the other thing is also true. I mean, they're gone,
Yeah.
and physically, they're not in my life anymore. And for a long time, that hurt badly.
Yeah.
There's a huge hole in my life, and then you heal, and then it did give me a pathway because I was what I finally came to was if I could be in that space and be with Mary Fran and Nolan, and I did it once, I could do it again.
Hmm.
And I just had to figure out how.
Hmm. Yeah.
And immediately the after the accident, within a year, I was traveling all over the world to these ancient sacred sites because I figured that there may be some juju there
Yeah.
that could help propel me back into the non-physical universe. So, I went to Stonehenge and the pyramids and the Sphinx, and
Hmm.
I went to Machu Picchu, and I went to more cathedrals than you could
Yeah.
shake a stick at. And essentially, the answer for me was nada, crickets. Nothing happened. I had a great vacation, but, nothing happened. So then it was more about trying a practice that might get me there. So I started with TM meditation, and I
Yeah.
studied with the Emoto religion in Japan, and I studied with shamans in both South America and North America. And I even went to seminary to see if there was something that,
Mm-hmm.
that they had. And it wasn't until I got to the Monroe Institute that's when I found the technology and the techniques that allowed me to enter into the physical, non-physical universe at will, be able to hold that so I can enter into it and hold it so that I could learn to practice. I could practice these things, and I could tour around and
Mm-hmm.
change my vibratory level.
Was
And
that through
yes,
meditation?
yeah, it's a form of meditation.
Okay.
Yep, yep, absolutely. And when I was at Monroe, I was able to reconnect with Mary Fran and later Nolan, and we have an active relationship today. Plus a bunch of other dead people.
Yeah.
It's always
Yeah.
kind of fun. But
So, Scott, what do you say to someone who's had one of these experiences? What do they do? How do they cope with this? How do they come back to reality? What would you say?
first off, be gentle with yourself. You have now discovered that you aren't what you thought you were,
Hmm.
that you are now, as a human being, we live in a multi-dimensional universe. And there's a part of us that is in all these different dimensions, and we're living them all at the same time.
Hmm.
And the be gentle part is that, remember I talked about filters. When we come into this physical world, we are given a set of filters that allows us to disconnect from that unity consciousness,
Hmm.
which is critical, by the way. You can't live in the physical world and worry about snakes in the grass and tigers in the trees and all of that while you're connected to everything in the universe. It's just not safe.
Hmm.
So, you know, we had to be able to focus in and be here in the physical, and they did a beautiful job with that.
Hmm.
And then when we had the near death experience, that filter just got traded in for a different one.
Yep.
And so now there's a lot of holes in the filter. It has different capabilities. So people, when they come back, they're changed,
Yeah.
that they're intuitive. Maybe they exude large amounts of energy, really quite frequent that people who've had near-death experiences can't wear
Watches.
especially
Yep.
electronic ones, and they screw up computers all the time, and TVs don't work, and it's just that vibratory thing that emanates from people who've had near-death experiences, and they just, you know, they've touched the love of the universe. They know at a very profound level that we are all interconnected.
Yep.
And I had one person tell me, she said, if I were to reach out and strike you, literally, I'm striking myself. And why would I do that?
Hmm.
That makes no sense to me. And so she goes on to describe, what it's like to live here in the physical world, knowing that you really are my sister,
Yeah.
and that we are one in not just in a song kind of way.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
it it's true. We really are made up of the same stuff. So that, and I typically point them to a couple of books that helps explain their experience, and and then when they're ready to talk about it, we talk, and then
Okay.
when they're ready, I'll take them back, because of the kinds of meditations that I have learned to do. I can take people back, and they can complete what they need to complete, or
Okay.
they can remember how it is to go back and talk to dead relatives, or be with divine beings, or
Mm.
know that there's more than one way to live a scene in our life. It's just
Yeah.
first rule: be gentle with yourself.
I think a takeaway from our conversation today for me is that love is eternal, and that to experience light and total love is a heart connection that defies time and place. And it brings me to Rumi, who says, "Put the cup of oneness in my hand and let me drink from it until I can't imagine separation."
Oh, that's lovely. Oh my. Actually, when I finished my doctoral work and I finished my dissertation, my advisor said, I finished with the defense. We got all done. He shook my hand and said, welcome to the academy. It's a nice tradition. And then he looked at me in the eye and he says, don't read a book for a year. Don't read anything for a
Oh,
year. Come back and learn how to be in the world again. And he said, if you have to, read poetry. And I started reading Rumi because it was,
yeah.
what was that man connected to? He
Okay.
was plugged into something that was truly extraordinary.
I have been reading him for 20 years, and every time I pick up one of his poems, it's like falling in love over and over again. I have to tell you about this book that just came out this year. It's called Gold Rumi, translated from Farsi by Halle Lisa Ghaffori. She lives in New York. She's of Persian descent. This is such a remarkably fresh rendition of Rumi's work. Oh my gosh. I have it by the side of my bed. I have one in my studio because you can't travel without this, Scott. Okay.
Got it.
So, Dr. Scott Taylor, I want to thank you for your work, your passion, your generosity of spirit, and to speak, teach, and explore what near death and shared death experiences mean so that we can, in your words, discover and live in unity. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pat, it has been a hoot. Thank you. I have really enjoyed our time together. I thank you for the invitation.
Oh, I'm just honored to have you here, and thank you again. And listeners, if you enjoyed today's podcast, okay, go tell your friends and please subscribe.